August 25th, 1944, northern France, just beyond the ruins of Chartres. The night was thick with dust and diesel fumes. A thin moon hung above the wreckage of France, casting silver light on endless convoys of American trucks rumbling eastward. Headlights were hooded in slitted black covers, engines growling like 1,000 beasts moving through the dark. To a group of retreating German soldiers hiding among the hedgerows, the sound was like thunder. They had been listening for an hour. The steady rumble never stopped. One truck passed, then another, then another still. Gott im Himmel, one of them muttered. It does not end. And it didn't. The Americans called it the Red Ball Express, a name taken from the red circle insignia painted on every truck that marked it as part of a high-priority supply route. Between the Normandy beaches and the rapidly advancing front lines, this living artery of steel and fuel pulsed day and night, 24 hours without pause. Private James "Shorty" Davis, a driver from Georgia, sat behind the wheel of his 2.5-ton GMC Deuce and a Half, knuckles white on the steering wheel. His convoy was one of hundreds moving along the same dirt road that week, each truck hauling gasoline cans, rations, artillery shells, and spare tires, everything the frontline divisions needed to keep rolling toward Germany. He hadn't slept in almost 36 hours. The road was a ribbon of chaos. Blown bridges replaced by makeshift planks, burned-out vehicles smoldering in ditches, MPs waving traffic through clouds of smoke and dust. Still, the convoy never stopped. The rule was simple: keep moving, no matter what. On the sides of the road, farmers and children watched as the trucks roared past, the mechanical heartbeat of liberation. To them, the sight was surreal, an endless river of motion. To the German soldiers retreating east, it was terrifying, because for years they had been told that American soldiers were soft, spoiled products of a capitalist nation incapable of fighting a real war. But as they crouched in the dark, listening to the never-ending growl of engines, that illusion shattered. "Where do they get all this?" another German whispered, watching the stream of trucks go by. "How can they have so much fuel?" No one answered. Each convoy carried enough supplies to feed and arm an entire division. By the end of August, over 6,000 trucks were operating on the Red Ball routes, running day and night between Cherbourg and the forward depots near Paris. Mechanics worked without sleep, drivers ate from ration tins at the wheel, and traffic officers directed thousands of vehicles across hundreds of miles of improvised roads. To the Germans, it seemed supernatural, as if the Americans had found a way to conjure fuel and ammunition from the air. But the truth was simpler and far more powerful. Behind those endless convoys lay the full industrial might of the United States, a nation that had turned its factories, highways, and people into one vast war machine. In the cab of his truck, Shorty Davis leaned out the window and shouted to the driver behind him, his voice barely audible over the roar. "We ain't soldiers, man. We're the blood in the Army's veins." And he was right. Every gallon of gas, every crate of bullets, every loaf of bread, it all flowed through these men, these trucks, this road that never slept. In the coming months, the Red Ball Express would deliver over 400,000 tons of supplies across France, keeping General Patton's tanks fueled and the Allied advance unstoppable. To the weary German divisions falling back toward the Rhine, it felt like fighting a storm that could not be stopped. They had once believed they could win with courage, strategy, and skill. But now, watching the horizon glow with the headlights of 1,000 American trucks, they realized the war had changed. This was no longer a battle of armies. It was a battle of industries, and Germany was losing it. September 1944. The Ardennes region, near Verdun. The roads were mud and chaos, churned up by tires, boots, and tank treads. Yet somehow, the trucks kept coming. Hour after hour, the convoys of the Red Ball Express thundered past shattered towns and burning fields, their engines echoing through valleys where, just months earlier, German artillery had ruled. To the men on the ground, it was simple necessity. To the Germans watching from the shadows, it was a miracle of logistics they couldn't comprehend. No matter how many roads were bombed, how many bridges blown apart, the Americans rebuilt them overnight. No matter how much fuel was consumed by their tanks, another convoy appeared the next morning with more. It seemed infinite, but behind that illusion of endless supply was an empire of motion, a vast humming machine that stretched all the way back across the Atlantic Ocean. While Germany rationed fuel and melted down church bells for metal, the United States was producing one truck every minute. Ford, GMC, Studebaker, and Dodge had converted their peacetime factories into war plants.
turning out more engines, tires, and spare parts than the entire Axis combined. By the summer of 1944, the U.S. Army had shipped over 2.5 million tons of supplies to France. Mountains of fuel drums, crates of ammunition, and rows of brand new vehicles stacked in ports from Cherbourg to Le Havre. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was the war's lifeblood. Private Clarence "Red" Johnson, a Red Ball driver from Detroit, used to joke that his truck had seen more action than most infantry. "Bullets? Nah," he'd grin. "I fight the clutch." But even he knew how dangerous his job was. German planes still prowled the skies, strafing convoys that strayed too far from Allied lines. Mines littered the roads. Accidents were constant. Sleep was a luxury no one could afford. Yet they drove, through rain, through darkness, through exhaustion, because stopping wasn't an option. Each truck carried 5 tons of supplies, and each mile mattered. A delay on one route could starve a frontline division of ammunition or fuel. The Red Ball routes, marked by giant red circles on every sign, were reserved exclusively for these trucks. No other traffic was allowed. Military police patrolled every intersection, ensuring that nothing slowed the lifeline of the Allied advance. Meanwhile, the Germans tried to make sense of what they were seeing. Captured Wehrmacht officers often spoke of it later with disbelief. One major, interrogated after the Battle of the Bulge, admitted, "We believed your fuel would run out. It never did. Every day new trucks came. New machines, new men. We could not understand how." The truth was that even Hitler's generals had underestimated the scale of America's industrial power. They had imagined the war as a contest of armies, not of economies, but the Americans had transformed theirs into a nation of factories, producing more steel, rubber, and gasoline than all of Europe combined. Every shell fired in France, every tank that rolled toward Germany, every jeep that crossed a bridge, all of it depended on the men of the Red Ball Express. And most of those men weren't frontline soldiers. Nearly 75% of the drivers were African American, serving in segregated units that history often forgot. They weren't given medals or headlines, but without them, Patton's Third Army would have ground to a halt. Under constant danger, they forged a road of victory, 1 mile at a time. One sergeant scrolled a message on the side of his mud-caked truck: "Through hell and high water, we roll." And they rolled. From Normandy to Paris, from Paris to the German border, the endless river of steel kept flowing. To the men in gray watching from the ruins, it was the sound of inevitability, the roar of a nation whose strength could not be bombed, starved, or stopped.
September 6, 1944, near Chartres, France. General George S. Patton stood over a map spread across the hood of his Jeep, his boots caked in dust, his temper boiling hotter than the engines around him. The Third Army had raced farther and faster than anyone thought possible, from Normandy to the Meuse in barely a month, but now it was running on fumes. His tanks, once unstoppable, were stranded on country roads, their engines silent, crews waiting beside them in disbelief. The mighty spearhead of the Allied advance had ground to a halt, not because of the enemy, but because the gas had run dry. "Damn it," Patton muttered, glaring at the horizon. "My men can fight, but they can't march on empty tanks." Then, far off in the distance, came the rumble. Faint at first, then growing louder. Trucks, dozens of them, then hundreds. Engines roaring, gears grinding, canvas flapping in the wind. The Red Ball Express had arrived. Each truck carried the golden lifeblood of modern war. 5-gallon jerry cans of fuel, stacked to the brim. Drivers jumped down, tossing them to waiting soldiers like buckets of water to a fire. Within minutes, Patton's armored columns were roaring back to life. He saluted one driver as the convoy rolled past. "Son," he barked, "you just won me another day of war." The men of the Red Ball had turned logistics into combat. Every trip was a battle against exhaustion, weather, and German sabotage. They drove without headlights to avoid detection. They slept in their trucks, ate cold rations, and often faced enemy fire. In 1 week alone, hundreds of trucks were destroyed by Luftwaffe strafing runs or accidents on the treacherous roads. Yet replacements kept coming, fresh from ports and depots. For every truck lost, 2 more rolled off the ships in Cherbourg. It was a system so vast it seemed alive.
a living artery pulsing from the beaches to the battlefronts. Each Red Ball driver had a simple rule: keep it moving. If a truck broke down, it was pushed aside and stripped for parts. If a bridge collapsed, engineers built a new one overnight. If a road was bombed, the drivers found another route. There was no waiting. The Americans had mastered something the Germans never could: momentum. German logistics, once fearsome in the Blitzkrieg years, had collapsed under Allied bombing. Factories burned. Fuel trains were wrecked. Convoys hid under cover of darkness, terrified of radar-guided air raids. The once proud Wehrmacht, which had stormed across Europe in 1940, now limped on horse-drawn carts and bicycles. Meanwhile, Patton's army, with its Red Ball lifeline, consumed 350,000 gallons of fuel per day. To the Germans, it looked impossible. How could an army sustain such a pace? How could every tank, truck, and plane be fed across a continent already shattered by war? For Patton, the answer was simple: the Red Ball Express. Even Eisenhower, who oversaw all Allied forces in Europe, called it the lifeline of victory. But that lifeline came at a cost. Drivers died on dark roads, convoys crashed in storms, and supplies were sometimes stolen, lost, or destroyed, yet morale remained high because everyone knew what was at stake. One driver, Private Thomas Daniels, wrote in his diary, "We're not heroes, we're haulers. But if we stop, the front stops, so we don't." By the time the Red Ball Express was finally disbanded in November 1944, it had moved over 400,000 tons of supplies, more than any single logistics operation in history up to that point. And though the soldiers on the front got the glory, it was the men behind the wheel who kept the war machine alive. To the Germans, it was demoralizing. Their spies reported that the American supply lines seemed endless, trucks filling roads for miles, headlights glowing like rivers of light through the night. The Reich had no answer for that. Industrial power had become the new weapon of war, and in 1944, the United States wielded it like a hammer.
October 1944, somewhere near Aachen, on the German border, the autumn rain fell cold and steady as Lieutenant Karl Weber of the Wehrmacht peered through his field glasses. Down in the valley, the American convoys crawled forward. Trucks, endless trucks, stretching farther than his eyes could see. "Mein Gott," one of his men muttered beside him. "They never stop." Weber lowered the binoculars, his face pale. He'd served since Poland in 1939. He had seen Blitzkrieg at its height, the lightning wars that once terrified Europe. But this was different. Blitzkrieg had relied on shock and speed, but what he saw now was something beyond strategy. A machine of sheer endurance. Every day, Allied shells pounded their positions with unrelenting rhythm. Every night, new American tanks arrived at the front. Even when German artillery managed to hit a convoy, the next morning the road was cleared, and another column rolled in. To the soldiers in gray, it felt like fighting a factory. An enemy that never slept, never tired, never ran out of steel. One captured German officer described it later with bitter awe. "We destroyed 100 of their trucks, and the next day we faced 200 more. It was not war anymore. It was production." The Luftwaffe, once Europe's terror, tried to strike back. Small groups of FW-190s and ME-109s swooped down on the convoys, strafing the roads, setting trucks ablaze. But the Allied air umbrella was too thick. Within minutes, Thunderbolts and Mustangs appeared overhead, diving like hawks to drive the Germans away. The skies belonged to the Americans. The roads belonged to them too. Germany, meanwhile, was suffocating. Allied bombers had shattered its railways, cut off oil from Romania, and burned its synthetic fuel plants to rubble. The Wehrmacht's mighty panzers now sat useless, abandoned for lack of gasoline. By contrast, the Americans were swimming in fuel. 1.6 million gallons per day flowing from depots, tankers, and the Red Ball convoys. Weber's men scavenged what they could. Bicycles, captured jeeps, even horses. One of his sergeants, once a tank mechanic, said bitterly, "The Americans fight with engines. We fight with memories." It was true. The German war machine, once the symbol of mechanized power, was now crumbling under its own shortages. Hitler's promises of secret weapons, the V1s, the V2s, were small comfort to the freezing troops watching an endless tide of American supplies roll past them. Weber lit a cigarette and watched as another convoy disappeared beyond the hills.
Somewhere out there, the front lines were moving again, east, always east, toward the heart of Germany. He thought of Stalingrad, of the winter of 1942. Back then, it had been the Soviets who seemed to have endless reserves, endless men. Now the Americans had taken that role, but with machines instead of manpower. They've turned industry into strategy, and strategy into inevitability, he said quietly. He flicked the cigarette into the mud and turned away. For the first time, he felt certain the war was lost, not because of any one battle, but because Germany could no longer keep up with the speed of America's production lines. The Red Ball Express wasn't just a convoy route, it was the physical embodiment of total war, where assembly lines in Detroit, fuel refineries in Texas, and dock workers in New York all converged into one unstoppable flow of power. The German officers called it the rolling factory, and as 1944 drew to a close, that factory was grinding inexorably toward Berlin.
November 1944. Allied headquarters, Versailles. Inside a converted palace hall buzzing with typewriters and radios, a large map of Europe covered the wall. Red lines, the routes of the Red Ball Express, snaked across France like arteries of a living body. At the center stood General Eisenhower, calm and focused, listening as his officers gave updates on fuel shipments, ammunition levels, and bridge repairs. To outsiders, it looked more like a factory control room than a battlefield command. But that was exactly the point. The Allied High Command had turned war into logistics, an industrial ballet that stretched across continents. Behind every bullet fired in the Hürtgen forest, behind every tank crossing into Germany, stood the invisible army of truck drivers, mechanics, dispatchers, and engineers. They didn't carry rifles, but they carried victory. When the Red Ball Express was finally shut down on November 16, 1944, it had transported over 412,000 tons of supplies, enough to fill 6,000 freight trains. The roads they used were scarred, the vehicles battered, but their mission had been accomplished. The front was secure, and the Allied advance was unstoppable. General Patton himself said, "My men can eat their belts, but my tanks have got to have gas." And thanks to those Red Ball boys, they always did. Most of those boys were young, underpaid, and uncelebrated. Nearly 3/4 were African American soldiers serving in segregated units. They faced discrimination in camps, were denied medals, and often worked under brutal conditions. But their performance silenced even the harshest skeptics. Colonel Loren Ayres, who oversaw one of the Red Ball depots, wrote later, "Those men proved that courage doesn't always carry a gun. Sometimes it carries a wrench and a steering wheel." The drivers themselves called it the longest convoy. They raced through nights lit by tracers and burning fuel dumps, through storms that turned roads to rivers, through fatigue that blurred vision into delirium. Yet the trucks rolled on, and in doing so, they turned the tide of the war. As winter approached, snow began to fall over France. Convoy routes were being restructured, replaced by new supply chains as ports reopened and railways were repaired. But the legend of the Red Ball Express was already sealed in history. American newspapers called it the artery of freedom. German officers, in captured reports, called it our greatest obstacle. Patton himself called it the most daring operation of the war. And long after the guns fell silent, historians would look back and see the truth. It wasn't just firepower that defeated Nazi Germany. It was mobility. The war had revealed a new kind of strength. Not the mythic hero charging with a rifle, but the relentless mechanical rhythm of an industrial superpower. The sound of engines became the soundtrack of victory. Every truck that roared across those muddy French roads was more than a vehicle. It was the embodiment of America's will, speed, and scale. The Red Ball Express proved that wars are not only won by those who fight on the front lines, but by those who make sure the front never stops moving. And to the German soldiers watching that endless procession in 1944, it became the clearest sign of all, that the tide of history had turned, and there was no stopping it now. The trucks rolled on, mile after mile, until victory itself ran out of road.